Today we're going to cover the Victor list that I took down my local RTN with, undefeated throughout the entire day. Our matchups are mainly Illusionist, Dromite and Prism, some Ninja, some Brute, and as well as a Kano in top 4. So part of my sideboard consideration was for Kano this event. We're going to go into the deck list. I'm going to have a really comprehensive maybe board because my sideboard looks really bad in this deck. For anyone who is somewhat interested in playing Victor, who's looked at lists, you're going to look at my sideboard and you're going to say that looks terrible. You have to understand that this is a local consideration based on the decks that I know that are going to be there. You kind of have to tune your sideboard, and there's no perfect answer for how your sideboard has to look. So we're going to cover that as well today. But main purpose of this deck is a mid-range value-based deck. You're trading damage, you're not full blocking your opponent unless it feels correct to do so. Guardian, of course, is a very flexible class in terms of both damage output and defensive capabilities. Not as much as maybe some other decks like Dash or Brute, for instance, that can really pivot on 4-card hands or 5-card hands with an arsenal. Of course, your 4-card hands in Guardian are not as good, especially in this deck with the block cards, so you really are looking to trade damage. Decks that don't want to trade damage with you, I think, are actually pretty tough. That would be things like, Tree Frog Dash, like setup decks that are not doing a whole lot, Combo Bolton, for example. But we, of course, have answers for all these decks. One interesting thing of note is this deck is only running Anathos. Part of this was I needed sideboard space for Arcane Barrier because I knew that there was at least going to be like 5 Kanos in my RTN. It's kind of interesting though, because as I played more and more with this deck, I actually don't really want Aegis for like any matchups except for potentially KO, which, I think that is enough of a consideration. But things like Azalea and Ninja, I think are so favored anyway. But this deck, that having like the extra, like 3 block didn't really make a huge difference. So I was pretty comfortable actually just cutting Aegis and Titan's Fist out of my list. I wasn't running Grindstone. I think Grindstone is a little too inconsistent. If you really get bad variance, your weapon is absolutely terrible. And passively milling cards is not relevant for basically like any matchups. I suppose into Azalea you kind of present like a secondary problem of fatigue, but it's really never super game relevant. So the potential of just revealing a clash card, losing a -1 counter, I think it's a little too punishing. So I was just on Titan's Fist when I was running Aegis, but like I said, it didn't feel like I actually needed it for those matchups. Like I was just getting edges into matchups I was already heavily favored into. The nice thing as well is that running mono Anathos in this list meant that sideboard cards that were only, meant to be played alongside Anathos are now perfectly fine on our main boards, so things like Terra Center, Rouse the Ancient. So that was my meta consideration for the day. We were also only running Balance of Justice. Crown of Providence, I think, is a pretty good card, and if you have the sideboard space to play it, you probably should. You get really good equity in the mirror. There's some other matchups as well that don't really draw cards, Warrior, for example, and it lets you arsenal block cards if you're ever, given tempo and you draw a hand with like Chokeslam, 2 blues, or like Spinal and 2 blues, something like that, and your last card in hand is a block card. It actually lets you arsenal it, and then with the crown you can actually like pitch stack it away basically for second cycle pretty easily, because the block cards are actually pretty hard to get into your pitch, because like it's never efficient. So getting in the second cycle block cards is actually like pretty sweet. But we were just on Balance of Justice for the day. I felt comfortable with my skill expression in like the Guardian Bear, for example, or just like traditional Dory, things like that. We didn't need Crown. Going into the main deck list here, we have just like traditional, Bravo cards basically, right? Like this is kind of similar to Bravo, but playing more with the value numbers, specifically, of course, with Tessa Strength, right? So it's been talked about a lot. I'm not here to, say things you've already heard, but I think the main reason to play this deck is that Tessa Strength is enough to put it above like the other Guardians, for example. I mean, Betsy is pretty much unplayable, but for example, Bravo, like this is quantitative value, right? Like hit all 3 of your Tessa Strengths, that gives you 1 extra blocking card for 3. So your hero power essentially just gains you 7, it's gaining you like 7 block, right? Or, if you want to put it in life total terms, you're gaining 9 life on hero power, right? It's not including things like Trounce. We're only talking about Tessa Strength here. Really powerful, right? And we're not even taking into consideration the high roll potential of revealing Golden Sun to something like Clash of Might. So, it's really a strong hero power. Of course, it's meta dependent, right? If KO is the best deck in the format and everyone is playing KO, then this deck does not function. You don't have a hero power, usually, right? You can go into the math and you will win in clashes against KO. If you run Aegis, it's also pretty likely as well. They run a lot of 5 attacks that are barely brought up to the 6 threshold with the hero power. So, you know, a lot of your cards will beat those, right? Especially your blues, right? You know, it's worth considering that this deck feels more meta dependent. But I think in a vacuum, it's very, very powerful. And I would not be surprised to see this be like a long-term contender, you know, based on what the meta looks like. So how do we actually play this deck? I would say it entirely depends on your knowledge of how to block correctly. I would say Guardian is mostly a value-oriented class. This does not mean it's a fatigue deck. You are not blocking out your opponent with all 4 cards. You are always looking for the most efficient damage to send back. So if you're a person who likes these kind of mid-range math-based decks in Flesh and Blood, historically this would be things like, you know, previously Bravo, of course, but also like Icelander, mid-range dash, things like that. I think this is a perfect deck for you. This is a deck where you just kind of look at the quantitative value of your hand, you find the best number and you send it. The only consideration is that you kind of go off a little bit on the math because of something like Anathos plus tech plating, right? So it actually is worse value to block 6 and send 6 versus blocking 9 and sending 4, right? But the thing with this deck is that your Seismic Surge really matters. This lets you have a 2-card 8 with Chokeslam or Debilitate. And that kind of stuff matters because these are kind of bad rates, but the on hits are good, right? So if Debilitate crushes, it's essentially a 2-card 10 because, you know, you use your Seismic, you just pay with a blue, and then, you know, you present 8 on hit, you get 2 value. So there's more to these cards, right, than purely the attack number. The crush is super relevant, but you do have pretty efficient stuff, right? So you have like, you have your 3-card 10s with Thunderquake, you have your 2-card 10s with Golden Sun if you have your Seismic, right? So once again, Seismic really matters in this deck. That's why I'm not really running Tunic. I think that you have enough defensive capabilities that you're always able to kind of like keep 2 cards to, you know, just Anathos plus tech plating every single turn when you take into consideration something like Test of Strength. And I would say that Guardian in general is a deck that gets better the more you know how to block other decks, right? So your knowledge of other decks, I think, is a skill check for how this deck functions, right? How good are you at blocking out Katsu? The answer is no. If you're not very good at blocking out Katsu, this deck will not work, right? You always have the ability to block like correctly, right? If that kind of makes sense. Your entire deck mostly blocks 3, your exception is Rouse, and you have an incredible fridge, right? So the question is, how good are you at blocking other decks? It's really a knowledge check, so I think this is a deck that rewards you the more you know about other heroes, right? If you know what part of Katsu's turn that you actually have to block, you know, if you know how to block Brute correctly, if you know how to block correctly in the mirror, like we can just go down the list, right? If your threat assessment is correct into Illusionist, right? Do you know what dragons that you have to clear? Do you know that you need to kill passing on site? If you're playing into Prism, do you know that Erudition is like the figment that you have, the angel that you have to kill immediately? What's your threat assessment of the other auras based on the board state? You know, it really is, it's a mid-range deck. So you're playing quantitative values and you kind of have to really understand the macro perspective of your matchup. So that's not something I can impart in one video, right? But that is an idea of how to play it. You're not like a synergistic, like, oh, I'm playing for this combo to kill my opponent. You're kind of a reactive, proactive deck, and you fluctuate based on who you're playing against and what the state of the matchup is, right? Like if your opponent burns a bunch of cards, plays a power turn, and they're not left with an arsenal, like don't take damage to send Spinal Crush, right? Like even if you're playing in a ninja, right? Like just like conserve your life, block out the power turn, see if they can replicate it on the next turn, and look for like a smaller window to play the Spinal, right? Or like don't take damage to play things unless if you're padding up your life total, right, with something like Test of Strength. You just have to be really smart and conservative. I think that you would gain more probably from blocking more often in Guardian than not, but this deck is also looking to just trade damage like every single turn cycle. Part of the reason why is with Test of Strength and Trounce, you draw so many cards that you just have the life total buffer. Normally it's incorrect to take like, let's say like 4 to 6 damage to play your Spinal Crush. Like if you're eating that much damage to play it, you're probably just better off blocking with it. But the thing is that if you can just like block, you know, with a Test of Strength, block 7, and then like draw a new card, and then you have 3 cards to play your Spinal, You have a 16-point turn cycle that also presents disruption, right? So in that case, like, it's probably fine to send the Spinal there. So just kind of think about things like that. Just be smart with your blocking and your attacking. Don't just like keep on throwing crush effects every single turn. You really have to wait and be patient for something like this. A few tips and tricks. Once you have golds late game, or if you know the top of your card is a blue, you can, with one card, you can one card 6 your opponent by just cracking a gold, drawing a new card, making a surge, and then sending your Amethyst to the new blue that you drew. You know, it's there, right? You can also do this if you're behind in a matchup, right? And you just kind of have to get a little bit lucky off the top to get back in the game. It'll come up maybe like once every 20 games, but if you're ever like 2 ahead on gold, and you're clashing and you think you're winning the clash regardless, you can actually sometimes use a gold to manipulate your opponent's decks. Like if your opponent shows you like a power card, you could actually just break a gold and bottom it. Once again, most of the time you are kind of tight on gold, so this is like for a very specific game state, but you know, the hero ability can actually be like a little bit like a weird version of Arachne's ability, for those of you familiar with it. This is probably intuitive for anyone who's played Guardian, but anyone who may be new to this hero, always pitch your Macho Grandes and your Terra Centers. Like, don't block with these. If you're going to be sending something on your turn, just pitch them. Block with your other blues. Like, you block with these, you pitch these, right? Macho Grande is your late game win condition. You need to keep that in your deck. Same goes for Terra Center. I would say there's only specific matchups where you actually want to take damage to play Rouse the Ancients, but if you are in a matchup where you do want to play Rouse, ideally your best hand for Rouse is either from Arsenal or on a 4-card hand where you have a red attack and blue. The main reason why is because if you send the Rouse the Ancients and you reveal, let's say, like red debilitate, blue debilitate, right? Like if that's your Rouse reveal, and of course you pitch a blue to play your Rouse, what that means is that you get to send the Rouse for 7, you get to pitch your blue to Amethyst for 6, and then you still get to Arsenal your red card. If you're ever like redundant on blues, I think that Rouse is much worse. Or if you're going to send the red attack after the Rouse, I think that's also kind of bad, unless you're in a very specific spot. But the fact that you can essentially turn 3 cards into 13 damage and still Arsenal a red card is like why like Rouse works so well with Amethyst. Yeah, that's the overall rundown on like the game plan. Basically, you said to be entirely reactive on how your opponent's playing. If your opponent's playing really aggressive, you have to ask yourself, is this a matchup where I brought in aggressive tools, right? So like Zealous, E-Strike, Rouse is already in my list, at least in the main board, and you have to ask yourself, do I win if I race back with my opponent? Most of the time the answer is no, so then the question is, okay, well, how do I block the most efficiently that I can? Am I full blocking until my opponent runs out of power cards and then I start looking for damage opportunities? Or am I trading back every single turn, right? And there's something like KO, for example, I'm not really looking to trade back a whole lot because their 4-card hands are normally a little bit redundant. They don't have as much, natural access to go again. So what's interesting is that like sometimes if I take damage to send 4, they already have a card that they want to block with, right? Whereas in some decks, like if I keep 1 card and send an efficient 4 damage back, they're not going to block it. And then I actually am like playing like good turn cycle math, things like that, right? Or am I in a matchup where I want to block 6, 10, 6 with the Amethyst? There's a lot of matchups where you do want to do that. So try to study other decks. It'll actually improve how you play this one. So I'd actually say spend less time probably learning about Guardian, spend more time learning about other decks. Rest of the deck, pretty standard, right? So we just have an aggressive package. Now something worth noting is that we have a lot less blues in Bravo. I think this list was only running, I will double check here, but I want to say 33. It was only running 33, right? Which is pretty crazy. If you play a lot of Bravo, most lists are between like 36, 40. So part of the consideration is that with the Tesla strengths, things like that, with the gold tokens, you're able to draw a lot more, right? Which means that you get left with larger hand sizes and you kind of have the ability to just always find like 2 blues. You also have some like bigger generation as well. So sometimes you are able just to keep like 2 cards and send Spinal or disable like these 5 attacks. So having the higher red density also increases your clash consistency, which actually feels pretty powerful. And the thing too with Bravo is part of it was you just have the hero power. So having the higher blue count means that you're able to pay for the hero power. Victor doesn't have that problem. So, if you have 2 blues and Spinal, you don't need to worry about, like paying for a hero ability, things like that. One more thing I probably should mention that I forgot to mention is tech plating. I don't like Tunic. Tunic is in this deck. I think that you're just gonna have more cards. That's the thing. With Victor, you kind of have to consider that you're probably going to be left with larger hand sizes, right? If your opponent plays a 2-card hand for, let's say, like 7 or 8, and you're blocking with a test of strength and some random 3 block and draw a new card, like you're looking at a 3-card hand, right? Like, what are you going to do with that? A lot of the times you could send something, but you're always going to have the ability to like pay for tech plating. I have found tech plating to be really strong in this deck. It lets you cycle right between your 5 costs. You just go like 2 blues, pay for your 5 cost, and then the next turn you can go 1 blue, pay for your 4 cost. Works really well with Golden Sun, right? So, of course, your end game with like Macho Grande, it feels really strong. I've really liked tech plating. Tunic is here in the list for 2 considerations, but we'll talk about that because we're going to go into the sideboard in just a moment. But to wrap it up here, we have some utility blues. I did like Terra Center, obviously having Anathos. Rouse the Ancients was main board just to clear up some sideboard space. I'm only on Clash of Might currently. Clash of Vigor is in the maybe board. We'll get into that. But I really like the fact that the +1 is like always relevant, no matter what your turn cycle looks like. There's some turns where if you make a Vigor, you can roll it into like your tectonic plating, but the +1 is like always relevant, unless if you're just passing your turn back. Very good, right? At the very least, you're blocking 9 and you're sending 5 with your hammer, 14-point turn cycle. But the other thing too is it really makes the crush card super strong, right? Spinal for 10 is so much more relevant than Spinal for 9. It means your opponent can't just give you 2 cards and stop the crush effect. They have to give you 3 cards or 2 cards plus armor. Ability for 9 is okay, right? Because that means that they can't give you a 3 block plus a 2 block on armor. So once you go through all the numbers, it's really powerful. And I really like it in addition with CNC in our sideboard, right? We have CNC in our sideboard for KO. So now it's time to get into our sideboard. So there were a few things I had to think about for this event. Number 1, the meta representation of Brute was fairly high in my local area. The meta representation of Kano was relatively high in my local area. Guardian was relatively low. Because of that, we made a few considerations. Number 1, Pummel plus Tunic. I don't think that this is a reliable game plan in your main deck. I don't think that Victor plays this kind of strategy exceptionally well. I think Bravo's much better suited off with these things like Tunic and Pummel. Pummel also makes your clash consistency worse. However, I do think that KO is a deck that's pretty prone to Arsenal disruption. It doesn't play kind of the same game plan that Reinhardt does, where you can just play Bloodrush Bellow and fire off and go ahead and play whatever you want. It really has to kind of sculpt a better hand with it, because you're looking for those agility tokens. You're looking for specifically go again attacks because you're nerfed on the 1 claw, right? I do think that it suffers from being pressured a lot on the arsenal. And I do think that part of the thing with Tunic is Tunic lets you block out most of the game and selectively pick your pivots. If you're trading damage back and forth with KO, I think you actually lose that game because of the +1 every single turn with the Might token, assuming that they're discarding every turn. So I think the thing is that with KO, you kind of want to selectively pick when you want to push. So that means like you're just blocking out whenever they're not presenting another agility token. It means that their 4-card hands are usually much weaker. You know, they'll have a 4-card hand and they could risk rolling scabs, but assuming they're on Bonebreaker, they shouldn't be rolling scabs. So they'll probably just play like maybe 1 card, discard something, maybe intellect penalty themselves like by 1 or 2. So you actually get pretty good efficiency blocking them out when they don't have an agility token present, right? Tunic means that you can block out for 6 turns and then decide you want to keep 2 cards and send Choke Slam, right? Or Debilitate. You get to keep your 2-card hand, pick off your Tunic, send your 8 attack. And it also lets you pivot right off your 3-card hands for CNC Pummel. You put the Pummel in Arsenal, do not do it in the opposite direction because they will just flush bag you. So you put your Pummel in your Arsenal when you find it, then you send your CNC, pitch your blue, use Tunic, you know how it works, right? I think that kind of disruption is pretty powerful into KO. It's, I think, just good enough even if you're on Anathos and you don't have like Aegis plus Titan's Fist. And these cards are also really good against Kano, the other one, right? Tunic means that you can just pay on the Wildfire combo turn, you prevent 5 damage just off your chest piece, and Pummel means that you get to accelerate the game very quickly. If you find it on CNC, you can just like clear one of their combo pieces after they've already dedicated, 2 cards to block. Also part of Kano's game plan, specifically in the Guardian, is like blocking with 2 cards and then just like chipping for 5 or 6, right? By just using Crucible and paying for a 2 cost. So if they block for 6 on something and you push over a Pummel, you've actually like gained yourself usually like 5 life plus like the pummel damage, right? So it's a pretty heavy swing because their 1-card hands don't do anything. So those were some considerations, right? So we cut like a red immovable that was previously in my list. We cut a red Thunderquake. You know, we're cutting Aegis and we're cutting Fist, so we have access to AB3, and it matters, right? I don't think that Victor is favored at all into Kana, but you can get there, right? I think that's important to realize. And looking at my local scene, I knew that I needed to have an out. I need to have an answer. I can't show up with no Arcane Barrier, because I do think that some of the Kana players were very good. I expected them to be in top 8 probably. Turned out to be the case. And, you know, because we brought Arcane Barrier, we won our top 4 match. So it's super relevant, right? Some other sideboard cards are aggressive Go Again package. That's E-Strike and Zealous. You bring these into like the Mirror for really good damage trading. You bring them into Dromai, right? You go hard, and you bring these into like Dash so you can pressure them really quickly. I also like them into Kasai. So in a Kasai, I've realized that the more aggressive you play, the better it is for you. The reason why is because if you're trying to block the Centauri Sabers, it doesn't work. You're just giving them that +1. Also, the longer you draw the game out, the more value they get out of Dynamo, the higher likelihood they have to resolve, you know, multiple raids and army tokens. And I think you lose that long game. So if you speed up the game clock a lot, I think it goes more in your favor, right? Like if the game is 8 turns, they gain less life, then, you know, if the game is 20 turns off of Dynamo. So I like the aggressive package. It also puts a lot of pressure on them to find some of their like setup pieces pretty quickly, like their gold generation, for instance, their copper generation. They have to find the right hands to get there quickly. Some other things in our sideboard are just like Red Macho Grande. I think you need closing power against grindier matchups, so that would be, you know, things like Warrior, things like Guardian. I like it into a lot of matchups. I don't think it's needed into aggro, right? So it's a sideboard card. But it does also give you really good turn 1 equity, both Red Macho and, you know, the Thunderquakes, right? So if you're put on the play, I think sometimes you just want to bring these cards in regardless, so you just have a really good answer on turn 0, being put in a less than favorable position, right? You would prefer to go second because we have so much disruption in this deck. You would just prefer to go second, especially with a high, you know, red density. Even if your turn 2 is sending Red Thunderquake, that is 1/4 of your opponent's health put, you know, on the combat chain on turn 2 that they now have to consider blocking. Trounce is pretty sweet. Card is really busted when it works, right? So when we bring it in, we're not really trying to bring in anything else that could potentially whiff, right? So you're going to bring this into decks that you're comfortable winning double clashes with. So, you know, Warrior, Ninja, the Brutes are kind of iffy. Into KO, definitely not, but I think there's a consideration for Levia and for Reinhardt. Those are decks that, you know, don't have that +1 from their hero power, but also they run a lot more utility cards, right? If you think about Levia, you're talking about cards like Art of War, Convulsions, you have like the blue Dread Screamers. We can go down the list, right? If you're talking about Reinhardt, we have Barraging, Sinks, Fates. I mean, that goes the same as well for Levia. Levia also plays Sink. So they have a lot of utility cards that are low power, if not any power at all. So I think you could probably get away with Trounce if you sideboard appropriately, right? So that would be, you know, bringing in like Red Machos, things like that into those matchups. So let's get into the maybe board, because I think this is where most of the interesting discussion is. These are all cards that I've either tested with, had in my list, or thought were really strong at one point. And I think that all of these cards shown here are all very viable sideboard options. I think if you put these in your list, I think your list is very good, right? But they're all meta dependent. So for instance, Prime to Fight is really insane if you're playing against Warrior. Specifically, the reason why is because with the Trounce, it lets you trade damage really efficiently with them. Warrior doesn't really care about the on hits. A lot of them don't matter, but also they want to block with cards anyway, right? If we're talking about things like Kasai, if you send Chokeslam that has no text, right? So let's say Debilitate, right? They want to block with 2 cards anyway. They're not really like a 4-card hand deck, right? They specialize on, you know, blocking as well as presenting damage. They're just like you. The other thing too is that because of Dynamo, right? Like they get to cover up Crush pretty easily. When you go into Dory, like Dory has 3 blocks, has cards that don't work on her cycle. She's fine blocking. She doesn't care. She has a huge fridge as well. So when you have Prime to Fight, which just lets you like block out their turn, keep 1 card, you put the Prime to Fight in Arsenal. It's like your only Arsenal target in the deck. and you just get to send like 11. Nuts, right? Like that drastically changes the matchup. It's not good in every deck, and in most decks it's vanilla damage, and if you don't have it along with Trounce, there's kind of no reason to run it. However, with Trounce, this card is like, I think, kind of broken, right? And now of course it requires setup, requires RNG variants, so I don't think it's like broken, but I think it actually is like one of the strongest cards in the deck, but it's entirely dependent on what your meta looks like and what the rest of your deck composition is. Pulverize is okay. I think it's fine. I don't really think you need it, but it's good for the mirror, right? It's good for some matchups. I kind of like it into Brute because it just blocks 3 like in the KO, but it will just be like a trump card essentially in terms of clash winning. Also just like really good turn 1 equity. Staunch. Part of the reason for me running Unmovable was because I was only on Anathos. The Unmovable lets you like, pitch a red, pitch a blue, and then send Hammer for 6, so you get to make your Seismic Surge. That's relevant if you already have an Unmovable in Arsenal, or like if you're playing against like Guardian, for instance, and you see them like pitch, we'll say like a Bravo, you see them pitch like Crippling, and you want to like counter pitch stack with your Unmovable, so then on your turn you have a really easy answer for it. Staunch doesn't really give you that flexibility, but I think that Staunch is still really powerful. Letting you just block 10, dominate immediately from hand is really good. I like this in something like Azalea, right, compared to Unmovable. We have our red Thunderquake and red Unmovable that we cut from our list to include pummels for the day of the event. If I'm expecting less KO or, less Wizard, we either cut into our AB or into our pummels here. We bring these back in. Righteous Cleansing is a pretty strong card. I like it for a few reasons. The yellow is good equity into Prism, right? This lets you potentially pitch, now you have 6 yellows. So you could pitch, get 5 intellect off library, or you could just destroy the library outright. I also think that the cycle is pretty good with Tectonic Blading, right? Because you can go 5 cost into 7 cost, right? So you pitch 2 blues, you play your 5 cost, you pitch 2 blues, you play your 7. It's for 10, and the crush is pretty relevant into combo focused decks, right? In a Prism, this would be really good. Obviously, like if you hit like Figments, you can drastically improve your matchup, hit certain auras. Like if you just snipe, for instance, like Rebirth or Erudition Figment, they can no longer ALS loop you, which is super relevant, right? You play this into things like Combo Bolton, right? If you can snipe a Lumina, the game is much better for you. If you play this in a Brute and you hit a Blood Rush Bellow, you kind of get what I'm saying, right? There's a lot of decks that don't play very value-oriented game plans, and they're really synergistic on certain combo pieces. Righteous Cleansing gives you the opportunity to just rip one from the deck and drastically improve your matchup percentage on the spot. That all you got's really fantastic tech for Kasai, right? Lets you react to the first Centauri Saber. And then like redrawing the card is really relevant, right? Because in the Kasai matchup, you're trying to be more proactive, more aggressive. This lets you do that. Clash of Vigor and Wallop were both on my list at one point. We ended up taking these out for Terrace Thunder and for Rousey Ancients. I still think these cards are really good, and I think if you're playing against more decks that you want to be clashing with consistently, that would be things like, like Ninja, Warrior. We can go down the list, right? But those are just like the 2 off the top of my head that are like meta relevant at the moment. Even until like Redline, Drum Might can be really powerful. Clash of Vigor, I've gone back and forth on over the Might. We already talked about it, but there are some things, right? If you're running Anathos plus Tectonic Blading, you're really only using the Vigor token most of the time just to play like a 5 cost. And while I don't think that's bad, I do think that the +1 when you're running things like CNC, Terrace Thunder, and these crush cards, I do like the flexibility that the +1 is always relevant, right? Sometimes the Vigor is not relevant. Also, it can be kind of awkward sometimes if you draw 2, or if you draw 4 blues and you block with a Clash of Vigor and you win, because what ends up happening is you make a Vigor token, which means on your turn, the Vigor token pops and you have to pay the Tectonic Blading with it, which means that you can't get 2 blues in pitch zone for Anathos. That's actually super relevant, and it has come up a few times, also including losing a Clash of Vigor in the Guardian Mirror when you just like kept 2 blues. So you kind of have to think about that. If you have a red or something, it doesn't matter, but something like that is like kind of awkward. And it does come up. We go to Aegis plus Titan's Fist. Once again, Grindstone. Being able to miss on Grindstone in any matchup, I think is way too punishing to just completely nerf your weapon for the rest of the game. No decks really care about the passive milling except for maybe Katsu and Azalea, but you're already beating those decks anyway. But if you want to run Titan's Fist and Aegis, I think you'd bring it in for Ninja, you'd bring it in for Ranger, You would bring it in probably for KO. I think it's pretty good into KO. That's kind of it, right? So I don't think it's like super necessary. And that's why, you know, I was able to get the Arcane Barrier in this list because I just like swapped over to Anathos only. Crown of Providence we already discussed, and Time Skippers is here to prevent the ALS loop. And of course there are other sideboard cards you'd include, right? Like off the top of my head, I was running Slap Happy for a little bit because it prevents 2, which meant that I could answer things like Blade Flurry and Kasai, right? So they go like Spoils of War, I block with like my boots plus the 3 blocks, I block for 5. Their Centauri Saber goes up to 5, they play Blade Flurry, I respond with, I get to respond with the Slap Happy, I make a Vigor token, which is pretty relevant, right? If you're playing Prime to Fight, lets you descend it to card 9, and the other thing was that the Slap Happy prevents 2, which means you can also essentially Spell Void 2 the Wildfire combo, which I liked that crossover. So you kind of have to think about cards like that, right? Like if you're trying to attack for 2 different decks, you know, think about how I approached it in my RTN with like Tunic plus Pummel. I was like, well, there's 2 bad matchups for me that I think will be well represented, and that's KO and Kano, and I think that this setup attacks both of them in a way that overlaps. Obviously, if I want to prey on Kano more, I would run Oasis. If I want to prey on KO more, I would probably just run an extra Pummel, things like that, right? Or I would run like Yellow Disables, so I just have more arsenal pressure. So you kind of have to think about things like that in terms of your deck building. There's no one size fits all, and Guardian is a class that is, you know, historically really reliant on its sideboard tech. But yeah, that's the list. So give it a shot. Let me know what you think. I don't think that Victor is solved, and I think that this is a snapshot of what my local meta looked like and the meta considerations I took into account for that event. It obviously paid off. Where is it? It obviously paid off well. So, you know, there's something to be said about the flexibility of Guardian's sideboard access. The fact that they always have really good tech tools, and if your fundamentals are clean and you just kind of know how to play the deck and you know how to navigate every single matchup, if you put in reps, obviously it'll pay off well for you. But until next time, thank you for watching.